Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of AOM's Entrepreneurship Division Global Scholar Development Committee, I would like to welcome you to our session on conducting entrepreneurship research in non-WIERD context. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please make sure you stay on mute during the session. We will have time for Q&A at the end. If you have any burning questions that you don't want to forget, you can put them in the chat box and we'll address them during the Q&A. We are very honored to have Dean Shepard as our guest speaker today. Dean needs no introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce him. So Dean Shepard is the Ray and Milan Siegfried Professor of Entrepreneurship at Mendoza College of Business, Notre Dame University. His research and teaching are in the field of entrepreneurship. He investigates the decision-making involved in leveraging cognitive and other resources to act on opportunities, responding with resilience to adversity, and learning from experimentation. Dean is a fellow at the Academy of Management. He has been awarded 3 honorary doctorates from the Entrepreneurship Division of the Academy of Management. Dean has been awarded the Dedication to Entrepreneurship Award, the Mentor Award, and the Foundational Paper Award twice. He is the past editor-in-chief of the Journal of Business Venturing. He has authored over 20 books and 180 publications in top management and entrepreneurship journals with over 72,000 Google sites. Please help me welcome Dean to our session. And Dean, we're all ears.
Okay, good. Thanks very much, everybody. And thanks for the introduction. It makes me sound very old, but that's okay. I suppose I'm getting there. I might just share my screen if that's all right. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about WIERD and non-WIERD research.
Dean, I'm sorry. I think you have to switch the display. We are seeing the presentation mode. If you go on, yeah.
And slideshow display settings.
Yeah, display setting, you just switch it.
Just duplicate. Is that it?
Don't duplicate. Do the swap presenter view. Oh, perfect. Now it's good.
That's good. Okay.
Yes,
very good.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So I'd like to present some research that we've done on conducting non-WIERD research, and I know looking at me, you can see that I'm weird. And really, this is just a play on words on what it actually means. WIERD means that I'm Western, educated from an industrialized country, rich and democratic. And we were interested in looking at Sarah Saju, who just got married. Sarah Chase, my PhD student, is from South Africa, and she's non-WIERD. And we thought it would be interesting to think more about what non-WIERD research is. We published this paper with Joachim Vincent in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice because we think that it's important and opens up a lot of opportunities if we start doing more non-WIERD research. So we started off by looking at Journal of Business Venturing and Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. And we looked at all the empirical studies, and 88% of them came from WIERD samples. All right, so from Western educated, industrialized, rich and developmental. And the reason why I think it's a play on words is because even though that's the dominant sample perspective, it's not the dominant where the population lies. In fact, the 2 most populous countries in the world are non-WIERD, and of half the population of the world is in 7 countries, and you can see the 7 countries there, but only one of them you would consider to be WIERD. And so we haven't done much research on non-WIERD countries or non-WIERD samples, and I'm wondering what's the result of those types of research. And it's almost a little bit like the drunk looking under the keys. I mean, why do we study where we study? Is because that's the easiest thing for us to do. But just because it's easy doesn't mean it's the most appropriate research. In fact, the more difficult it becomes, perhaps that's where the opportunities lie. So in this article, we really talked about we need to have more scholarly attention focused on non-WIERD research. They're not the only groups that are underappreciated. So when we wrote this paper, people said, well, what about people who don't speak English? What about women? What about different groups? And we're not trying to claim that this is the only area that's been underappreciated in terms of research. There are plenty of other areas, but we were just focusing on this for this particular paper. When I speak about my good friend Johan Wickland always said that we don't do research, we do me-search. So how could I be doing research about non-WIERD samples when it's not who I am? I am from Australia, and so I came to the US, so I have a slightly different perspective as an outsider. But also I want to think about research as doing research. And as I said to you, I've worked with Sarah and we worked with Joachim on this particular paper to try and get this different perspective on research. When I first came to the US and I was publishing papers on using Australian samples, the reviewers would often ask, well, how does this generalize to samples in the US? And you would think, well, why does it need to generalize to the US when it's a global journal? So I used to put one line in there, this may or may not generalize to samples in the US. That becomes an empirical question. But even then, it kind of represented the fact that, a lot of the journals going back, 2 decades ago were somewhat biased against non-US samples. I'm not sure that that's the case anymore. But even if it is, it's up to us to try and kind of push along why this research on non-WIERD samples is important. So that's really what I'm going to talk about here. I have some implications for us as researchers, but also as reviewers, and maybe even some implications for editors. But I told Gulshan that I wanted to keep my presentation relatively short so we get some time for some question and answers. So I suppose the first question is, all the theoretical work that we currently have, let's just say in the Journal of Business Venturing or Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, but I think it's the same in the academy journals and beyond, is that most of the research is based on WIERD samples. And then we say to ourselves, okay, if that's our knowledge base, is it transferable to non-WIERD contexts? If it is transferable, then that's important information that we want to know. So hopefully people engage in replication research to say, the theory that we have in the literature, it actually does apply in these particular contexts. That's important to know. But what if it doesn't apply? And that's where I said, how exciting, in that most entrepreneurs in the world, we haven't studied as part of our representative sample. So if these current theories that we have don't apply, then we've just opened up the field of entrepreneurship to a whole lot of opportunities for generating new knowledge, perhaps more contextualized knowledge rather than more generalizable knowledge. So there's kind of two implications here, is that non-WIERD research may or may not apply to WIERD contexts, but it shouldn't be a requirement that they have to justify your research in a non-WIERD context by saying that it does or doesn't apply to a WIERD context. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean. So, then I had to, when I was working out this paper, I had to kind of define what these terms are. And so what is non-Western? There's a whole lot of research on, as I look further into this topic, about the global South. And in this paper, I'm talking about non-Western rather than the global South, is because the global South kind of implies something similar, in that it's talking about kind of development and poverty and things like that. But but of course, Australia, where I'm from, is from the South, and it's not considered part of the global South. So when we talk about Western, we're really kind of talking about this kind of Western heritage as well. But there are obviously there's so many other areas of the world that we haven't studied if we're focused mainly on the Western. East Asia, South Asia, Arabia, Latin America, and the Sub-Saharan Africa. So there are just some regions there that we haven't done much research on. And it might be important because if the way that people think impacts the way they engage in entrepreneurship behavior or entrepreneurial behavior or entrepreneurial action, then surely the national culture will have an impact on the way people think and their attitudes and their knowledge. So therefore, you'd think culture would also have an impact on entrepreneurship. And so I kind of ask a rhetorical question there. Is there a problem with using one culture to understand how all entrepreneurs throughout the world engage in entrepreneurship? And the answer is obviously, I don't think so. I think culture probably does have a big impact. So there's opportunity for research to engage in entrepreneurship research in non-Western cultures, or compare entrepreneurship across cultures, whether it's a Western culture and a non-Western culture or multiple non-Western cultures. Or even within a country, there might be areas that have a Western culture and other areas that have a non-Western culture. And maybe we need to investigate those. So there's lots of opportunities to look at non-Western elements. Same with kind of the illiterate countries. I've listed the 25 most illiterate countries here in the world, because most of the research we do is on literate samples. Right? But what about entrepreneurs who are illiterate? I mean, we don't have a good understanding of them. And part of it, I suppose, is that we don't have good research methods for capturing people's attitudes and decision-making of people who are not literate. Because most of the things we use is surveys, or we use numbers, or we use other, let's say our classical measures may not apply or unlikely to be useful in trying to understand entrepreneurs with low literacy rates. And also there's a lack of numeracy as well. So we're missing out when we're sampling WIERD samples, we're missing out on this very important population where entrepreneurship may be their best choice. If you lack this kind of human capital in terms of education, if you lack that, then entrepreneurship may be your primary mechanism for looking after yourself and your family. And if we focus only on WIERD samples, we're missing out on all those entrepreneurs and studying them. Also, non-industrialized. So we're often focused on high-tech ventures or even medium-tech ventures. But what about in kind of low industrialized regions? And there the focus is mainly on agriculture and craft hand labor. There is a literature, obviously, in entrepreneurship on kind of rural entrepreneurship. But even then, it's mainly in kind of these more WIERD countries. So I think there's an opportunity to study more about entrepreneurship in non-industrialized countries or non-industrialized regions, looking at kind of low tech, often family funded, and typically with low growth. And, you know, maybe some people say, well, that's not entrepreneurship, but that might be a very weird perspective of what entrepreneurship is. Maybe we need to think about what entrepreneurship means differs when we put ourselves into these kind of non-WIERD contexts. So I think there's also more work that we can do on impoverished regions. You know, that picture there is the slums in India, where I've done a few studies now. So the non-rich really means they have low income and low resource endowments. The thing I really like about the possibilities in these contexts is that I'm interested in thinking about how do we engage in entrepreneurship when we don't have many resources. So in the past, we used to think about entrepreneurship as you need resource slack. You need to be able to have the time in order to experiment. But then, of course, Baker and Nelson, when they talked about bricolage, or we've spoken about jugaad or frugal innovation, it's more about how do we engage in entrepreneurship when we lack abundant resources, when we have few resources, and we can make do with the resources we have at hand and combine them and recombine them in kind of creative ways. And so that's very interesting to try and understand, how do people without abundant resources, how are they creative, and how do they engage in their entrepreneurial action in order to try and improve their lives and their families' lives and the communities around them. So again, I mean, we can do research within a country, across countries, or even within one country, focusing only on the kind of the non-rich regions of those countries. And this is an area where, in particular, I have very little expertise whatsoever, is when we talk about what does it mean to be entrepreneurship in a non-democratic country. Australia's democratic, the USA is democratic. I've spent a lot of time in Europe, which is very democratic. Spent doing research in India, which is democratic. But here, I had to try and define what I mean by non-democratic. And some of the literature talks about these different forms of government we might consider as non-democratic. Really, the definition of democratic versus non-democratic is not as important as to say, what does entrepreneurship look like and how does it differ in countries that have different governance systems than we're used to? And in this case, we don't see a lot of that research, but we have seen research coming out of China. And when we look at entrepreneurship research in China, one thing they seem to emphasize more than we emphasize in our normal WIERD samples, or in our WIERD samples, is a focus on kind of political connections and the importance that political connections have in promoting kind of this entrepreneurial action. So at least there it kind of says, at least when we're looking at China, there are some other attributes and skills and social networks attributes or social capital that's different in like the communist China than it is in some of these other democratic countries that we studied primarily in our entrepreneurship journals. So I just tried to offer what I meant by democracy and what's non-democratic. But the main point is that I would just like to be able to see entrepreneurship research engaged in these kind of different governance systems as well. I also talk about, the rule of law, political connections and things like that. It's important. Different countries will have different formalized cultures, formalized institutions, and other countries will rely more heavily on informal institutions. How do these particular differences in contexts impact entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial action, and the like? So what are the implications of saying, hey, we've got to do some more non-WIERD entrepreneurship research? I think it opens up way more interesting research questions. Some of the questions are simply, does it replicate in these other countries? Other theories, other instances might say, in this context, it's extreme in certain attributes. How do those attributes impact what our current existing theories are? So it really kind of adds a moderator to what we understand. Or perhaps it brings up something we've never thought of before, and we have to have this kind of more indigenous theory or a highly contextualized theory that applies in this particular place. In that case, I suppose we've got to start developing new theories. And if we're going to develop new theories, it's not likely we're going to be able to use deductive theorizing, right? Take what we understand from the literature in order to offer propositions or hypotheses that we test, because we're assuming that those literatures apply in those contexts, but they may not. And if they do not, then we may have to engage in more abductive research and more inductive research. So by abductive research, I mean more investigating things empirically and then trying to understand what those anomalies or differences mean. Or inductive research, I mean by having more kind of grounded case study research where we're building theory from the phenomenon rather than coming from the literature. We might have to be more innovative in methods and measures. I gave you the example of, how do we get research? How do we get data from entrepreneurs who are illiterate or semi-literate if we can't use surveys and existing measures? How do we do that? So I think we'd have to be more innovative in terms of methods and measures. I don't mean to imply that doing research in non-WIERD context is easy. In many ways, I think it's the opposite. It could be very difficult. It could be very difficult to publish results in about non-democratic countries. It could be very challenging to go into very poor, impoverished locations to collect your data. But I think what makes it difficult also makes it a very valuable, attractive opportunity for research. And that's the thing that excites me the most. If there is a bias against WIERD samples, then I suppose it's up to us, because we're the community, on how to overcome those biases. In the papers that I've published on not using non-WIERD samples in non-WIERD contexts, I've found the reviewers and the editors are very excited about raising these kind of new issues in these particular contexts. And then once those papers are published in those top journals, I think it offers a foothold for others to also go ahead and cite those studies, and we can start building on non-WIERD entrepreneurship research and kind of opening up these opportunities. So I think I'm on, roughly about 25, 30 minutes, because I really wanted to have a discussion more than just listen to a guy from a WIERD country talk about non-WIERD research.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean.
Okay.
Feel free to put your questions in the chat box or raise your hands if you have any questions. I'm going to start by a question that was in the Q&A. So related to the issue that you brought up about journals, they're asking, our top journals tend not to publish replication studies. How would you suggest scholars to go about testing theories developed in WIERD contexts in non-WIERD settings, given the career pressure to publish?
Yes, and it's an excellent point, because so many senior scholars, I suppose I just did it myself, says we need to do more replication research, and then we realize no one wants to publish the replication research, right? But I would say that the journals are open to replication research, and I would say, can I give you an example, is Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice has a specific mechanisms that when you submit the paper, you say it's a replication study, and it goes through a completely different review process with different editors and different reviewers with the expectation of the replication. So I think the first part is, yes, you can do the replications. But the second part of the comment, I suppose, is there's replications and then there's replications. And so, it could be more than just a simple replication of exactly the same method with the same sample. But when you take it to a different context, maybe you start to add different moderators to it or different explanations. So it's kind of a replication, but it's broader than a simple replication. So I think we can publish replications, and we can also kind of write papers that are kind of like a hybrid of a replication, but also something that's more contextualized, and we might be able to theorize more from that replication. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Andrea, you want to go next? Ask your question.
Sure. Hi, Dean. Thanks for the presentation. So a question regarding the potential for publication. I don't know if you followed social media last week. There was a massive discussion around economic journals and that scholars from the global south find it very difficult to publish this research in economic journal. And I think the same applies to entrepreneurship journals. There is really interesting research. I'm based in Africa. I was before in China, like about entrepreneurship in different contexts. It just doesn't get published in the top journals because of language, because of prejudices whatsoever. I think it is a wonderful art.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, she got broken up.
Okay, I understand the point. Hopefully, Andrea can hear me. Are you there, Andrea? No. Okay. Yes, it's the first thing I'd say is it's tough to publish in the top journals anyway. Doesn't matter what you're writing about or what you're doing. It's very tough. Also, you know, as research starts to get published in those top journals, which is happening, it gives you a foothold in order for you to be able to cite and move on from those studies as well. But one of the things Andrea mentioned was language, and language makes it more difficult to write, to publish in the top academic journals, because writing becomes very, very important to be able to communicate your ideas in a very clear and succinct way. So unfortunately, if English is your second language, you're at a disadvantage in trying to publish your papers. So I suppose I have two responses here. One is English is my primary language, but I still use a copy editor before I submit an article to a top journal, just to make sure that it's clearly polished as best it can. And then the other thing is I had a discussion with Johan Wiklund, who's the editor of Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, about artificial intelligence. And, you know, I was talking about my concerns, and he said it could actually be a wonderful thing in that people who do good research but have their publications, have their research not published because their English language is not as high as a native speaker, that AI might be able to solve that issue. And so I really like that idea that AI could be like an emancipation, in that it allows good research to not be held back by the obstacle of not having perfect English in order to be able to get published. So it's hard to publish in the top journals, but it's hard for everybody. And I think there's a growing interest in these kind of non-WIERD samples. Not to say that that bias doesn't exist, but all we can do is we can just do our best to try and overcome those biases.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. So thank you very much, Gulshan and Dean, for this opportunity. I had Dean, you are very humble. You take some time sometimes to reply to me. I was international entrepreneur. I was working with airport airfield lighting system, runway, and things like that. I was engineer before. And what I'm feeling in the academy, when I've been to the Academy of Management, that there is a big gatekeeper. Why I'm trying to say that about gatekeeper, I felt that autoethnography, do you remember I asked you about autoethnography? You told me try to use measures and things like that. I believe if you need to understand what is the non-WIERD, okay? I believe we need much more entrepreneurs from different countries and to provide their storytelling. An entrepreneur transitioning to academia. To do that, I believe we need to promote autoethnography. First of all, and you tell me if you agree or not. First of all, I believe there's a lot of entrepreneurs, they are dyslexics. And they're doing well. So dyslexics in different countries. Even Sir Richard Branson, as a Virgin Group, is an entrepreneur. He trying now to create his own university because, you know. And secondly, you say something very important. There's a lot of people, they are illiterate in different countries, but they are as well entrepreneurs. Or in country when there is war, there is as well entrepreneurs. And why I'm telling you that it is, do you think that we really need to promote autoethnography and try to broken, this glass ceiling, you know what I mean, and promote a qualitative research, because now I'm doing what you call the psychology approach to entrepreneurship, to understand what I mean, and I would like to see your insight about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, I mentioned in my presentation, we might need to come up with new methods, and those methods are probably going to have to be a lot more abductive or inductive. Part of that could be ethnographies, for sure, that ethnographies might be able to play a role. Ethnographies, or I think you said autoethnographies, or ethnographies about yourself. There, I'm not so sure, because I really don't know. But the one thing I wanted to say about methods, if possible, if it's not a new method, is that you copy or closely follow someone else's method. So if you're going to do an ethnography study, can you go to the Academy Management Journal or the American Journal of Sociology or something and find someone who's used the similar sort of method that you're using? And then can you put your words and your ideas and your efforts onto that kind of structure? So when we want to be innovative, we want to be innovative in the content, but we may not want to be innovative in the structure of the paper. Maybe we don't even really want to be innovative in the method. We can say, this method has been used in this place, in this place, in this place. I'm doing nothing new. I'm using that same method, but I'm coming up with new content. So in some ways, I'm trying to say that you want your paper to be distinctive and offer something novel. But in other ways, you want to be able to say those other parts of the paper are very legitimate and they're very rigorous. So we can't throw away rigor in order to get the relevance. We've got to try and be able to have a little bit of both. So I think I'm waffling on the answer a little bit. I don't know much about these kind of this.
I'll just say I'm focusing on my own experience, okay,
Yes.
in autoethnography, on autographer, because I believe the difference between the weird and non-weird, there is an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that's make the things, I believe, we always talk about unicorn.
Yeah.
And
Right. So I would just say to that is, because whether it's weird or non-weird, entrepreneurship or non-entrepreneurship, these sorts of ethnographic methods have been used for other research questions. So I suppose I would ask you to say, have you seen any ethnographic studies published in management or sociology or psychological journals? And then I would try and use those as exemplars in order to conduct your own study on that related to the non-weird entrepreneurship research. If you don't see any studies that have used that particular method, then it's going to be tough, to tell you the truth. You might have to write a research methods paper first to say why the method's appropriate. It's going to be tough to be able to be novel in both method and the content. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means it's going to be tough.
thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two of the questions that were in the chat box. So Dean, do you believe any one of these 5 dimensions have more promise compared to the others? And kind of related to that, how about countries that fall under more than one of these dimensions?
Yeah. So the first one is, I think just my own personal preference is the rich one. So I've been doing my research mainly on impoverished regions, because I like the idea of this kind of creativity and positiveness and proactiveness that can occur despite the fact of having such few resources. I mean, we really need to be creative and novel as entrepreneurs in those particular contexts. And I think that's because I'm taking from more a psychological perspective. If I was from a more macro perspective, I say non-Western, right? Because that's the way the cultures impact each other. If I was even more macro or more political, I think I'd be interested in the democratic versus non-democratic. But I'd just say, just my personal preference, it's the rich, the impoverished. Yeah, I mean, most of them are kind of combined in many ways, right? You know, you're either weird or you're non-weird, but sometimes some are one and not all the others, but often it's a combination, right? And I suppose that opens up even more interesting research questions, you know, in that it's even more contextualized, or let's say it's even more different than weird if I'm from a non-rich, non-industrialized, non-educated country. I mean, surely entrepreneurship is going to look very different in some aspects than something that's weird on all the 5 dimensions. So yes, I think the intersections become important and become particularly interesting to study.
Great, thank you. Adwoa, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Dean, for the presentation. So my question is a bit, I guess it follows up a bit on Andrea's initial question. I do believe that there's a lot of research on entrepreneurship that's happening already in non-WIERD context. So I'm originally from Ghana, and I know that there's a lot of research happening in sub-Saharan Africa as well. But when it comes to the question of publishing in top journals, like you rightly said, it is difficult to publish in top journals regardless of where you are. But at the same time, I can't help but wonder if I don't even really know how to phrase the question, but I can't help but wonder if the push to publish in top journals could be counterproductive in some way, because there are journals that are also specific to these different regions that we're trying to publish about. And I think that maybe also a different perspective we could look at is kind of also empowering these journals or empowering these outlets a bit more, because they are also more easily accessible to those who do research on these very areas that we're talking about. I guess that's like a very big picture question, but it's just something that I wanted to raise.
I know exactly what you're saying. I mean, I talk about how to do it and publish in the top academic journals purely because that's my motivation to do it for myself, right? It does not, I don't mean to imply, and I'm pretty sure I didn't in the paper, to say that research doesn't already exist elsewhere, and that all other outlets are inappropriate. They are obviously appropriate, right? So there's many different aspects. So I suppose I was just saying that if you want to do this research in this particular journal, this is how you might go ahead and do it. But also you said, you know, maybe we need to give greater prominence to some of these other journals. And I agree with that as well, that we might consider 2nd tier or 3rd tier journals, is because when I wrote this article to talk about non-WIERD research, I really had to kind of start citing a lot of the journals that I would not normally read. And so maybe as we start to give greater prominence, as we start to research these particular topics, we do reach into these other journals that are that have been doing this work for a while, and then you said might be more accessible as well. You know, also, I don't mean to say that top academic journals are the only way we can have an impact. You know, we could be writing books, and I think, you know, the earlier question about the ethnography could be better as a book or as a different form of publication. Maybe not necessarily a publication in Academy Management Journal, for example. So I agree with everything you said, basically.
Okay. Thank you. Colbert?
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Just one quick question, because you already mentioned in the article that there is the requirement of disengagement in the weird context, because some countries are weird on some dimensions, some are not, right? So my question to you is, if we consider this as a macro level of these dimensions, what would be the second level? Because in India, where you gave example of Dharavi, which is a slum area, on the other extreme end we have Bangalore, Delhi, which are like giving competition to Silicon Valley, right? So within a country, how do you see those contexts?
Yeah. I mean, it's the easiest way to think about the weird and the non-weird is to think about countries, isn't it? But as we have a more nuanced view, every country probably has some variation in those attributes, and that's what kind of also makes it particularly interesting. Maybe we don't have as many variations within a country in terms of the democracy, but everything else we do. We have more industrialized areas, less industrialized areas, more impoverished areas, less impoverished areas, you know. So if we want to do research on this topic, but we live in a weird country, doesn't mean you can't do this research. You've just got to find it within the country. You know, I'm a little bit conscious when I do research in India and I do it in impoverished communities. I don't want to be, you know, an external person saying all of India looks like this, right? I mean, it's really quite a naive perspective to kind of say all of India is poor, when the opposite is the case. You know, in some ways, you raise another interesting question is, you know, what happens when you've got even more variation on these attributes, right? So it's not necessarily an impoverished, like a non-rich country. It's actually high variance in terms of richness. You know, some other countries might be high variance in terms of industrialization or things like that. So, I mean, I think that just adds another dimension to it. So, yes, we can do research within our own country, even if you, regardless of whether you're in non-weird or weird. But also, I think that variation can actually be very important as well. I mean, those slums sit by some of the richest real estate, you know, in the country or in that region. And also, you know, it's not just about countries. It could be regions within a country or regions of countries. So it's really an umbrella concept, or very abstract concept, just to say, hey, we need to do more specific research, and we just need to be specific about what we're studying.
Thanks. Just a small follow-up question. So to go next, do you see how we can operationalize or quantify these dimensions of weird and non-weird? Do you see any potential there?
Yeah. So, you know, if you want to do research that compares weird to non-weird, then it's very macro based, right? I prefer to just take one or two, as someone said, multiple dimensions, and I focus in on one. So I'm going to say, you know what, I'm really interested in trying to understand entrepreneurial action in the absence of resources, and this is what I did. And I said, well, where do we not find many resources? And I thought, because I was working with an Indian colleague, and we said, what about rural India? I mean, in a place we choose a place that has rural India where it has few resources in order to be able to study that context. So I think it's more about what's your research question and how you want to study it. Comparing the whole thing of weird and the whole thing of non-weird is very macro, and it's not something that I would actually do. I'd rather be interested in more what's the intersections of these things. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question from the chat, which talked about, like, they were asking about your opinion, Dean, about what should scholars who are in weird contexts and who are interested in conducting research in non-weird contexts do. What suggestions or recommendation do you have for them?
Yeah, I would say get a really good PhD student from a non-weird context, which I have. Sarah Chase, fantastic doctoral student from South Africa. And so in about a week or 2 weeks, she's going back to South Africa to collect some more data on the settlements in South Africa. And before she even started the doctoral program, she said, what data can I collect so we can do some research together? And we discussed, you know, what's her interest and where she's from. And she went and collected a whole lot of data on wild abalone farming in South Africa, and how it took away the sustainability of this species, and how they introduced abalone farming in South Africa. So we talked about how, you know, the unsustainable practice may actually lead to an opportunity for kind of sustainable development, and how these two things kind of match together. So for me, it's hard to just go straight into a non-WIERD context in which I have no experience, because we like to do me search, and that's why I'd say we do we search, right? So find a partner is probably the easiest way to do it. Find a local co-author. And for those people, you know, when we say how difficult it is to publish in the top journals, it is. But if you're in a non-WIERD country and you're able to partner with someone from a WIERD country who has been able to publish in these top academic journals, then I think that advances both people, right? So the person in the WIERD country might be wanting to do more interesting research than they've done recently, and be able to help the person in the non-WIERD country with all the little practical practice things that help get you published. But they can offer a whole lot of skills in collecting data and answering questions and interpreting the data and those types of things. So those partnerships could actually be very fruitful.
Thank you. And somebody just suggested that we can start finding co-authors here. So feel free.
Yeah.
The chat, the chat
Absolutely.
is yours. Yes.
Absolutely.
Feel free to start making those. You can start making those connections right from here. Havaria, go ahead. Havaria Abbas.
Okay, hello, Dean. How are you? It's just a fan moment because I have done my PhD in entrepreneurship and I read your work and a lot, and I must appreciate. Talking to this non-WIERD context, I'm from Pakistan, and I feel that this is probably the most relevant context here. But the important avenues which we can possibly explore under this context is, like you talked about bricolage. Once we talk about bricolage, so how do you define it in a WIERD country might be different from the definition in a non-WIERD context. I mean, if the countries have abundant resources, then resource scarcity might be entirely different for them. But once you come to the countries like Pakistan, then what might be resource scarcity for you might not be the resource scarcity for us. So it is basically the definitional difference, but I worked on the same concept of bricolage behavior and how to overcome the resource constraints, and what possibly the entrepreneurs in Pakistan do that sets them apart and make them successful and perform along different avenues. So the same concepts which you said that, okay, all the concepts or maybe the theories which are applied in WIERD context may not be applicable in the non-WIERD context, but I believe that many concepts are applicable here, but the difference might come from your aspect and our aspect. Yeah, what is your lens of viewing the bricolage and my lens of that, how do I see bricolage behavior? So if for example, you might consider it as like if anything happens which cannot, like you cannot plan a trip to abroad, maybe like in a vacation, that might appear as a resource scarcity for you, but for us it may be the inability to meet the day-to-day expenditures that it is difficult for us. So yes, these concepts are very much applicable here. So how would you recommend us as a researcher, because we are the entrepreneurship researchers here? So it's very interesting. The entrepreneurs are extraordinary performing here. As somebody from India also suggested, that we do have different people. Somebody who is living in Bangalore, maybe living in a very developed city, as compared to somebody who is living in slum. So the same applies in Pakistan as well. It's like we have a number of entrepreneurs who are outperforming, and then we have lots of population who are still struggling to meet the basic needs. So under these contexts, definitely, I would rather say the definition might vary, but the concepts from the WIERD context can apply here.
Sure.
Just my little 2 cents.
No, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that's kind of the exciting aspect. I mean, that, you know, the constructs that we have may apply, but maybe the operationalizations are completely out of whack. So I think I in my slides, I talked about human capital. I mean, we often talk about in the WIERD context of, you know, human capital in terms of education, and the low level of education would be some high school, where that whole notion of measuring human capital through education in some countries may not apply whatsoever. But I think, you know, when we talk about how do we publish in the top journals, I just want to take your point and take it further, is to say the ideal way, I think, to position research is to say, here we have existing knowledge, but I'm going to explore it in an extreme context. And when I explore it in this extreme context, I'm pushing the knowledge boundaries or the frontiers further, right? So an example would be, to continue with your example, is, you know, research in WIERD contexts has looked at bricolage in terms of resource scarcity. But that resource scarcity, let me tell you about resource scarcity. You know, when we go to an extreme context of extreme resource scarcity, how do these things completely differ? Like our mindset, the entrepreneurial mindset, might turn less about what are the potential opportunities for growing my venture, and might be more about how do I survive next week. So, you know, just our fundamental assumptions about what entrepreneurship is and how it operates could be completely different, because even though we're talking about the same construct, it really represents something at a more extreme level, and therefore it takes on a completely different approach. So basically, I agree with what you're suggesting, and we need to be conscious of that sometimes we might be using the same word, but it actually means something a little bit different in those particular contexts. But I think that's an exciting thing to explore, really.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. And yes, for just as you talked about the human capital, I would say that we also have that social capital, which I feel most of the times that we fulfill all our limitations and boundaries. We just break them with the help of a social capital, which we inherit being a collectivist country, where people are interconnected and everybody is like more of a reciprocal obligation. The thing same in China, but it is also practiced in true letter and spirit in Pakistan as well.
Right. I mean, that's getting back to the WIERD. I mean, the Western part and the non-Western part is the Western part's very kind of, I suppose, if we can classify it as individualistic. So if 88% of our entrepreneurship studies are in individualistic countries, maybe we're underestimating or understating the importance of kind of social capital and community spirit and collectivism and things like that. So maybe in our published research, we don't have enough information about those things, despite the fact that most entrepreneurs live in non-Western countries.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You.
Michael, go ahead. Michael, you're on mute. You just have to unmute.
No, still on.
Yeah. Michael, you just have to, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. So thank you, Dean, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you also for your help providing me with that fantastic review. Unfortunately, we got R&R at Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, and we hope that we'll be able to address the comment from the reviewers. But my concern has to do with the conversation now around the WIERD, non-WIERD. I think that somehow it's taking us away from research which is done by what we call gap spotting to now problematizing the concept within a particular context. Because reading your papers, I come to the understanding that the WIERD, non-WIERD kind of conversation helps us to move away from the universalistic paradigm, which sort of neglect the relevance of context, i.e. both situational and contextual factors in studying maybe entrepreneurial cognition or entrepreneurial action. And so ideally, a time is coming where spotting gaps in a research and trying to make an argument will no more be strong enough to convince reviewers, but now it's going to be problematizing the concept within a particular context and then trying to provide a nuanced understanding of how the concept works in this unique environment as compared to another environment. Yeah.
Right.
So that's
Yes.
the understanding I got from reading your papers. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, you either have context as a boundary condition to the theory that you create, or you have context as a moderator where something occurs, or a mediator, something occurs in one context but doesn't occur in another context, or it occurs more strongly. So I think that, there have been calls by Frederica Velter and Ted Baker and people who have talked about, we need more contextualized theories of entrepreneurship. I agree with that. But some theories might be more generalized and some may be more contextualized. But I agree with your characterization that really what I'm talking about here is kind of contextual work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. Hayat Sadat. Hayat Sadoui. Hayat, if you're asking a question, you're on mute. You can now unmute and ask your question.
No. Oh,
Hi.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, Professor Shepherd. Thank you for this stimulating talk. I often work on cross-cultural questions, comparing entrepreneurs from Western and non-Western contexts. Interestingly, I frequently find that the results from the non-Western group are statistically non-significant, even when the same constructs yield strong effects in Western samples.
Yeah.
Do you think this reflects a real contextual difference in underlying psychological mechanisms, or rather a limitation in how our constructs and measurement tools, developed mostly in weird settings, capture meaning in non-Western contexts? And how might we begin to fix this issue methodologically or conceptually? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. I mean, the methods were probably created for use in Western cultures, is my guess. And then, therefore, it may not be highly effective at trying to capture it in non-Western contexts, which is what your hypothesis is. I suppose that would be a hypothesis worth testing. And then if it doesn't work, either that or there's more heterogeneity in that non-Western context than you anticipated. So maybe one way would be to take a more narrow sample in the non-WIERD context, and it might be more homogeneous, and therefore the measure might be able to create it, might be able to capture it better. But if it doesn't, then I suppose we need to go through our normal process of how do we create a new measure in these non-WIERD contexts. And I think that's going to become more important, right? That most of our measures are created for WIERD contexts, and they may not apply in non-WIERD contexts, and we'll need to develop measures for them. But I think what you're proposing is interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Dean, do you think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the questions in the chat box was about a concern on how the majority of the reviewers, editors, and associate editors are from WIERD contexts. Do you see that as a problem, or do you have any recommendation on how we can overcome that?
Yeah. I think things are I'm normally optimistic. I'm normally optimist. So I think things are improving. We always used to think the Journal of Business Venturing was very United States centric. But the first editor was from South Africa. The second one was from India. The third was me, Australia. The fourth was Jeff from the US, and then now Canada and Switzerland. So that wasn't so US centric, but it's still very Western. And although obviously Venkat was from India, I think it's changing. I think you'll find the composition of the review boards are changing. I think the editors are now conscious to get greater diversity in their editorial review boards and their the associate editors, not for other reasons other than I think they want to encourage more research from those regions. And we need those reviewers. I just went through a process and eventually had the paper accepted I was writing about the slums in India, and one of the reviewers was someone who'd done an ethnography living in the Dharavi slum in India, and so they were able to push us on a few things that actually really improved the quality of the paper. And so I suppose I would say to people who are listening here, why don't you send a letter to the editors of these journals and offer your services as a reviewer? And even if you're a junior scholar, still just reach out to the editors and say, look, I'm a junior scholar, but I'm willing to learn. And they might use you as the third reviewer. They might use you in the academy management uses bridge reviewers so that you can learn. But when you think about the journals and you think about the reviewers, they are us. We are them, so we can influence these things ourselves. So the first step is become a reviewer for the academy management meetings. That's the very first thing. They're always looking for that. And then also offer your services to the editors. And then as we become better reviewers and we get to publish more of these things, then we become associate editors and things kind of move that way. I know it moves slowly, but I think it's moving in the right direction. And I think, this whole forum that Gulshan has set up is a movement in that direction as well.
Thank you. It's actually set up by the Entrepreneurship Division. Vishal Gupta, the Entrepreneurship Division, is actually here. The chair of the Entrepreneurship Division is here. Yeah, we are very lucky that the Entrepreneurship Division was one of the first divisions at AOM to recognize the need to have a global scholar development so we can have these conversations and activities.
Absolutely.
Deepa, go ahead.
Hello, Professor. I am Deepa from India. Actually, I'm very thankful and grateful to you for your research contribution in entrepreneurship because it inspired me to do the research in entrepreneurship. And my area was entrepreneurial growth. So I need your recommendation or suggestion how I can carry out further research in the mixed context. Like India, it's a mixed context, weird and non-weird.
I missed the one word. In the what context? In the
mixed context. Like India have both context.
Yeah.
Weird and non-weird. So how can I?
Yeah. So and we're talking about growth, right? So I think to go back to an earlier comment, maybe growth means something different in those particular contexts. So if I can just tell you a very quick story, I wrote a paper about Jugaad, I think, and we talked about growth. What does growth mean in India? And we're thinking that these people who are highly inventive kind of have they're innovative. I say they're innovative. And the reviewers would come back and go, it's not innovation because it didn't create a sustainable competitive advantage for the firm. And so then we wrote back and we said, yes, it doesn't create a sustainable competitive advantage for the firm, but it creates all these things for the inventor, the individual, and it creates all these things for the community. So let's talk about it as inclusive growth or inclusive innovation. And then the reviewer ended up buying our story. And I think that was a classic example of where they're applying an understanding of what innovation means, has to be at the firm level, and it has to be profit for the firm. And when we go to this particular context and we think, well, that may not be particularly important, that it's has this intellectual property protection for the innovation, that it gets shared and that it benefits the individual and benefits the community, but doesn't benefit the firm. And so this reviewer had a hard time understanding that as being something to do with innovation. But through that conversation, we were able to kind of develop it. So, so to your point, I mean, growth may be different things to different people, whether you're in the weird context or the non-weird context, and understanding those differences may be interesting.
Perfect. We're gonna
Okay,
have
thank you.
Abhihana, you ask our last question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Dean, for your insights on WIERD and non-WIERD context. I have two quick questions. First question is, how do you see WIERD in non context of international entrepreneurship? Because here, like the entrepreneurship is not constrained to a single country, and it would be impacted by multiple countries as such. My second question is, we have been talking about generalizing of the insights, how we can isolate different dimensions, because within a country also different multiple factors are collectively impacting the entrepreneurship. If I talk about cultural, social, and economic factors, and as a researcher, it would be difficult. Like for a country, economic factor would be having a higher effect. In some other country, it would be on a or like on a lesser side. So how to go about the generalization of the things?
Yeah, unfortunately, your audio moved in and out a little bit, but you know, we don't have to apply these contexts. And I think this is what you're saying at the country level. It can be within the country. So, you know, the earlier comment about, you know, in India, there's some impoverished regions and there's some very rich regions. And then I chose to do some research in the slums of India, not to represent all of India, but because I wanted to study what does entrepreneurship do in this highly impoverished context, and how do they treat resources, and how do they engage in resources, and what's their entrepreneurial mindset in that particular context. So depending on your research question, it'll inform you about what your sample is, or who your sample is, or where do you go for your sample. So I'm less interested in, you know, at the country level, but that's just my interest. So if I go to a non-WIERD country, I would specifically choose the regions that kind of would give me the variation or give me access to the data that I would need in order to be able to answer my research question. So I'd say focus on your research question, then think about where your sample, the best sample for answering that research question is, and think about more in terms of regions than whole countries. But if you're a country scholar, then you'd stay at that level, of course. I don't know if that answered your question or not. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Professor Dean. So my first question is, I wanted your insights on WIERD and non-WIERD context on international entrepreneurship.
In international entrepreneurship?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay. Well, very good. So I mean, it's you know, you've got to go ahead and classify countries based on the extent to which they are W, to which they are E, to which they are I, to which they are R, and to which they are D. And then you can conduct the research. So it may not be dichotomous on that. It may not be WIERD versus non-WIERD, but it may be Western, non-Western as a dichotomy, or it could be some form of continuum on a lot of these variables. But I think it's ideally set up to study at the country level. And it could be comparisons between WIERD and non-WIERD, but it could also be comparisons between non-WIERD and non-WIERD, right? So how they can differ based on some of the non-WIERD might be democratic and the other ones may be non-democratic, or, you know, ones might be richer and the other ones may be more impoverished. So I think it sets up quite easily to do it at the country level.
Thank you, Professor Dean. Thank you.
Perfect. Dean, thank you so much
for
thank you. This conversation. This was definitely valuable. Thank you to the participants for attending and for the wonderful conversation that was happening in the chat box. So there was a really good, engaging conversation that was also happening in the chat. So I would like to thank everyone. Dean, folks have asked me to share the slides with them. Are you okay with that?
Yes. Do you have them?
No, I don't. So if you
email I'll send them to you. Yes.
Okay. So I will share the slides with everyone. The recording is going to be shared on Entrepreneurship Division's YouTube channel. If you are not following me on LinkedIn, please do, because that's where I will post the link when it becomes available. The Global Scholar Development Committee also have more events coming up. We are actually organizing a couple of local workshops where folks submit their work and they get feedback from mentors. We're going to be at INDAM, India Academy of Management. We're going to be at DIRI, the Diana International Conference in South Africa. We're going to have a workshop on Middle East. So please follow me on LinkedIn, and I will post our events and opportunities there for everyone. So thank you again, Dean. Thank you. This was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's session. Until next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.